As Cameron's tenure draws to an end and the 2015 general election approaches, there are a few major economic policies facing Britain today. How parties plan to deal with these problems will play an important factor in determining which party takes over the government come next election. The first major factor is oil. Britain, which imports the vast majority of its oil, is at the mercy of the market and the policies of oil producers. Although it only imports 25.8% of its oil from OPEC member states, because of the hyper-interconnectivity of markets today, the policies of OPEC and other nations directly influence oil prices in Britain and its economy at large. So what exactly is OPEC, and why is it so powerful?
OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's made up of 12 countries, including Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Kuwait, and Iran. The group controls about 80% of the world's oil reserves and 45% of global production. OPEC was founded in 1960 in a bid to control the export of oil to the rest of the world.
Because no one can really predict what OPEC and other oil producers will do, one can only speculate. There are two major speculations in regards to oil prices and how they'll affect Britain. Firstly, if oil prices continue to fall, as they have been, the British economy will continue to see growth and prosperity. This is due to the fact that Britain is a service-based economy and certainly needs oil to operate. So the cheaper the oil, the cheaper the economy can operate, there more room for profit, investment, and growth. The second and more unfortunate scenario for the British economy is if oil prices were to rise. The market has been manipulated by OPEC for years to ensure small supply in conjunction with the world's high demand, leading to a large margin for OPEC and its members. OPEC has only increased supply, therefore decreasing the price of oil, in order to put oil producers in the US and Norway out of business. When these producers can no longer afford to operate due to low prices, they will shut down, leaving OPEC on top. The plan was to eliminate the competition and then artificially raise the price of oil again. Currently, they are in the stage of trying to regain influence and control over the price per barrel, which is now extremely low. If OPEC were to succeed in its measures, it will put the competition out of business once again and raise prices through market manipulation, and therefore Britain's economy will suffer greatly. Dealing with OPEC and finding a sustainable route to oil independence will prove a major economic challenge for UK policymakers in the coming years. The next major challenge facing Britain's economy in the coming months, in fact, is inflation. Britain's inflation is currently at 0% for the first time since 1960. Decreasing inflation is like borrowing tomorrow's prosperity for today's prosperity, as history will show. With rates this low and a prosperous UK, it will soon be time to pay back that loan. The table on the left shows GDP growth, while the graph on the right shows CPI inflationary levels. When the UK increased inflation in the late 50s, GDP growth slowed. When they turned to deflation shortly after, a period of GDP growth occurred. Finally, inflation once again rose and a period of slow and negative GDP growth once again followed. These corrections occur when the government and banks seek short-term gain over long-term success. This actually speaks to Britain's political system. This is partly the reason why markets experience the natural cycle of booms and busts. The market will always correct man's attempts to manipulate it. Today, Britain once again finds itself at 0% CPI inflationary rate for the first time since 1960. Historically, this means that a big correction is coming, as inflation will soon rise. This will lead to a negative reaction in GDP growth and perhaps another recession. The obvious solution will be to keep the inflation rate at 0% from here on out, or to simply gradually increase it over time insofar as it won't dramatically affect the economy, but it's not that simple. Before we can dive deeper into this problem, we first need to have an accurate definition of the economic factors we're dealing with. It's time to go back to the basics. If you've ever been told by a high school history teacher that inflation is how much money a government prints, you've been misinformed. Inflation is measured by something called CPI, Consumer Price Index. CPI uses a basket of goods approach that aims to compare a consistent base of everyday products from year to year, such as the price of milk, eggs, toothpaste, and a haircut. When the government reports that inflation has risen by 2%, they really mean to say that the sum of the goods tracked by the CPI index have all risen by a collective average of 2%. This distinction is key because much more goes into the oscillating prices of goods than just money supply. One of the most integral factors affecting inflation in the UK is something called ICE LIBOR, short for Intercontinental Exchange London Interbank Offered Rate. Owned by NYSE Euronext Incorporated, the same multinational firm that owns the New York Stock Exchange, ICE LIBOR determines recommended interest rates, called LIBORs, for banks and financial institutions around the world. and over $350 trillion in assets reference and utilize LIBOR in some way. LIBOR is determined and published each business day. ICE LIBOR polls major banks in London and around the world and requests the interest rate at which major bank would lend to another major bank on that particular day. LIBOR takes the lowest and highest interest rates from the worldwide poll, averages them, and reports their findings. The interest rate published, called LIBOR, is used to determine mortgages, consumer loans, and bank loans worldwide each business day. This dramatically affects CPI, the measure of inflation. Imagine a man who wanted to open a bakery to compete with an already established bakery in the same town. He can't afford to open it himself, so he goes to the bank for a loan. Because the LIBOR rate is 0.5% that day, he decides he can't afford to borrow the money and build his bakery. He therefore does not compete with the rival bakery in the town when prices stay the same, meaning that CPI, or inflation, remains the same for this particular hypothetical case. If a LIBOR rate was at, say, 0.3%, he could have borrowed the money, built his bakery, competed with his rival, and brought down the cost of baked goods in his town, therefore driving down the inflation rate. Albeit, the single case would have minute effect on inflation. When amplified and applied to the hundreds of millions of people who owe loans based on LIBOR, it's easy to see that LIBOR does in fact play a role in UK's inflation. And nowhere is LIBOR more used than the UK. Inflation, therefore, is determined not only by money supply, which is important and does play a big role in CPI, but the worldwide outlook on the economy as determined by major banks through ICE LIBOR. So, inflation is a complex economic metric which must be studied and treated delicately in policymaking to achieve the most desirable results. Will Britain accept the correction, or try to manipulate the market with more policy and try to stave off increased inflation? This is a major issue for the coming months and years of Britain's economic development and should be treated as such in the next election.